So we're going to be covering the modern materials and methods section here, starting now. So around 1850, modern materials began to change architecture. Modern building materials that we're going to cover are cast iron, steel, reinforced concrete, carbon fiber, and cross-laminated timber. And these new materials allowed for new architectural forms just because of, their qualities, their unique qualities when compared to the traditional methods and materials. So the first thing that we'll talk about is cast iron. And it has a lot greater strength than wood or stone. And once the smelting process was perfected in the 19th century, cast iron and wrought iron were becoming important casting materials after they perfected the smelting process. And iron made it possible to make walls non-load bearing. And architects first used this material typically in like factories, railroad stations. They used it to build bridges. But we're going to take a look at an example called the Crystal Palace by Joseph Paxson. It was located in London, built in 1850 to 1851, and it was cast iron and glass. And it was a really interesting new piece of architecture utilizing this new material of iron, and we'll talk about it now. So this is the Crystal Palace. It's located in London. Like I said, it was made in 1850. So it was designed basically to show off the material of cast iron. It was a new material and everybody was really excited about it, and a lot of new architectural forms were possible because of it. And this was actually built in 6 months, and it covered 19 square acres, or 19 acres of parkland. I don't know if it was square or not, but it was 19 acres of parkland. So it was located in a park in London, and the materials for the structure were lightweight, especially when compared to traditional materials of wood and stone. And so it's actually made of modules, which are standard-sized factory-made units. So, and the modules were made of cast iron and glass. And really, the architect, Joseph Paxson, took a complete departure from traditional materials and techniques. And he really developed a whole new vocabulary with this building. It's something that we've never really seen before in architecture. And it's in large part due to the new building material that he was using of cast iron. The structure itself actually became the ornamentation, which is a little different than traditional architecture. The modular units were allowed, basically the modular units that were used to build the structure were built on site. They were built over existing trees, and later it could be taken apart and moved across town, which is actually what happened. The building was eventually destroyed by a fire in 1936, and it kind of highlighted the fact that early cast iron buildings were very susceptible to fire, because the cast iron kind of buckles when exposed to heat and causes the building to collapse. So that's kind of an interesting material that was, new at that point. So steel and reinforced concrete, we'll move on to that. This was kind of developed in between 1890 and 1910. And this is kind of when new construction methods began to break through for large structures. The invention of high-strength structural steel happened. Steel frames, elevators, and rising urban land values led to the development of the skyscraper during this time. And the idea of the skyscraper originated in Chicago. And this is because in Chicago, it was a very urban area, but there was a destructive fire that actually swept through in 1871, and it cleared a lot of space in the urban area for new building. So they had a building boom in Chicago of the urban area, and it kind of started to become the breeding ground, so to speak, of the idea for this skyscraper. So we'll talk about, one of the first kind of early skyscrapers that was developed by Louis Sullivan. It's the Wright Building in St. Louis, sorry, Missouri. And the interior structure is reflected on the exterior design. So take a look at this building. This was built in 1890, 1891. This is the Wright Building. The exterior design, like I said, reflects the interior structure of the building. So you can really tell that this is a steel frame. Just by looking at the design of the exterior, you can tell it's a steel frame in the inside of the building. So that's a little bit of this is a departure to some degree from traditional architecture. Height is really emphasized in this building. The vertical shafts between the windows really lead the eye up into the sky and cause you to look up, and it's definitely emphasizing the verticality of this building, which is the case for most skyscrapers that we're going to be looking at. In even these lines here, they resemble columns as well, like with capitals at the top. So those do resemble columns. So he is borrowing a little bit from traditional architecture, but not a lot. He divided the building's exterior facade into 3 sections. So the lower section kind of is basically where the shops are. The middle central section is where, let's see, the offices are. And then at the top, there is basically an area for the utility rooms. And these areas of ornamentation that are all a little bit different kind of divide up the building for what they're being used for. So, I mean, this has a different use here, this has a different use here, and this has a different use up here. So he's almost sectioning out stylistically sections of the building and kind of almost visually telling us that there's different purposes for each of these sections of this building, basically. And there's a band of really heavy ornamentation up here at the very top. And it kind of stops the eye from moving upward. So these lines might lead our eye up, but this heavy band is really kind of serving to cap the design off and finish off the building, and almost creates kind of a sense of completion in the design. So one major thing to remember about this building is that the external design of the building shows its internal structure and functions. So the fact that it's divided up into 3 sections, the fact that it looks like a steel frame, it's showing that there's a steel frame skeleton under there, which is the structure, but also the function of the building is influencing the design of the building as well. So that's kind of new in modern architecture. Those are new concepts. In this functional spirit, modern architecture arose in Europe between 1910 and 1930. So modern architects rejected decorative ornamentation, and they tried not to use traditional materials. They thought of building as a useful arrangement of spaces. The international style is the style that kind of developed out of these ideas. And some main characteristics of the international style were to express the function of each building and to show the building's underlying structure in the external design. The buildings were usually asymmetrical and used only modern materials such as glass and concrete and steel. So we'll take a look at another kind of example of some modern materials and methods here. So we'll talk about the Domino construction system developed by Le Corbusier. And we'll take a look at this. This is what it looks like. This is the Domino construction system, 1914 by Le Corbusier. He's a Swiss-French architect. And this shows the internal structure of the building in the external design. I mean, the whole design of the building itself is just the structure of the building, which is the way that it's put together and the way that it holds itself up. It shows the steel columns that support these reinforced concrete slabs for each level of the building. Um, so it's called the domino construction system because it kind of resembles the game of dominoes. He had the idea of supporting floors and a roof on interior load-bearing columns, so they're kind of set back from the edge of the building slightly. This took the weight from the walls, so it took all the load-bearing it took all of the load off of the walls so that the walls on the exterior were no longer load bearing, and even the interior walls were no longer load bearing. The only load bearing things are the columns themselves. This allowed for more windows, which let in more natural light into the interior of the building, which was kind of a nice thing because back in the day, they weren't, able to add in a lot of windows, so you didn't have a lot of natural light in traditional buildings. But with this invention of this domino construction system, they were able to really open up the exterior walls to the natural world, and natural light was allowed into the interior. The main load, like I said, is on the columns, and that meant that you could arrange the interior walls however you wished. This led to a lot of flexibility in the floor plan of this type of structure, and the architect called this a flexible space. He called this flexible space a machine for living in. So that's kind of how he viewed this. Just checking to see what time we have. Okay, we're still doing pretty good. Okay, so we'll move on to the next building it's actually the Bauhaus Building, built in 1926 through 1927. Walter Gropius used the principles of the International Style in this building. It's called the Bauhaus Building, like I said earlier. Bauhaus is actually a design school that was located in Germany, and this is the workshop wing, and it was built in 1925 through 1927, and it basically followed the same concept illustrated in the last slide we looked at. The roof and the floors are supported by steel columns that are actually set back from the outer edge of the building a little bit, so that the exterior walls don't have to support any weight at all. And there's actually a curtain wall of glass here on this whole wall is made of glass, basically, which really opened it up to the exterior environment. Lots of natural light. This is actually called a curtain wall. So curtain walls are made of entirely of glass. Interior walls were non-load bearing, so they could be placed wherever they were needed, and it could be arranged by the architect however they wanted to without any thought to, where do we need to put a load bearing wall? They didn't even have to think about that. They could arrange it however they wanted to. So next we're actually going to talk about the famous architect, and I don't know if you guys have ever heard of him, but his name is Frank Lloyd Wright. And he was an American architect, and he was basically one of the first to use open planning, this idea in actual residences and houses. And he did this even before the international style took hold. He was kind of somebody that was doing this before it became popular, really. He used steel frame, skeletal structures for his buildings that he created. And this allowed for the elimination of walls between rooms. And this really opened up the interior spaces. And the steel skeleton allowed for enlarged windows as well, so that you can bring all that natural light in. And with these devices, he created these really beautiful flowing spaces, that opened up to the outdoors, welcomed in natural light, and basically he tried to blend the houses into their surrounding natural environment. I think I'm going to wrap up the video here, and we will start back up talking about Frank Lloyd Wright in the next video.